This is a Going Back, Remembering UGA interview with Frances Tolliver Thomas, longtime preservation activist and author of A Portrait of Historic Athens in Clark County. Fran, thank you for allowing us to visit today, July 27th, 2015. I should mention that we are in Athens in the Thomas home, only a short distance from the UGA campus. I also should mention that our Going Back crew was here a few weeks ago to interview Fran and her husband, Dr. Emery Thomas, and that we had so much information to cover that we felt we needed another visit. Fran has graciously allowed us to return to continue our discussion. Others with us today include Alice Vernon and videographer Bill Evelyn, members of the Going Back crew, and Nell, the family dog, and I'm Fran Lane. Fran, good to be back.
Welcome.
Maybe we'll just do this every several months.
That works for me.
We know you grew up in Virginia. Tell us how you got to Athens, Georgia, a town for which you wrote what has been described as the definitive account of a place that makes history each and every day.
Well, I moved here with my husband, Emery Thomas, when he joined the faculty of the University of Georgia in 1967. Was his first job out of graduate school and then the Army, two obligatory years from our OTC days. We moved here with our two sons, who were then 1 and 4 years old, planning to live here a couple of years, and here we are 48 years later, still living in Athens, Georgia, which we love.
Well, and for which we are glad. Virginia has worked to protect its great historic sites and heritage for years. Do you think it was growing up in that environment that stimulated your interest and concern for Athens and its heritage?
Probably had a lot to do with it. My parents were very historically oriented to the visual landscape. Loved architecture and landscaping, and we visited many places on Sunday afternoon rides. When we passed a dilapidated house in need of restoration, they'd say, my brother and I would say, there's Mother's dream house. So it's always kind of been with me.
Well, we're glad you brought it down here with you. You were an original member and chair of, and let me say this correctly, of the Athens Historic Preservation Commission.
That's right.
In what year was that commission created?
Well, the ordinance was passed in 1985, and at that, shortly thereafter, they appointed a commission that is appointed by then the City Council, then later the Clark County Commissioners, of 5 people, and that rose to be 7 people, and we were charged with the task of designating historic sites, districts, neighborhoods, structures for protection under a historic preservation ordinance. And what that meant is if you lived in a designated area or a designated structure, if you were going to make significant changes to the exterior of that property, then you had to seek a certificate of appropriateness through the Historic Preservation Commission, and that still goes on today.
What was the catalyst for the creation of the commission?
Well, we were the 23rd city in Georgia to come on board, which is very after the enabling legislation on the state level. The catalyst was that we were losing landmarks right and left all over the state and a lot in Athens, Georgia. One can study the saga of Prince Avenue or many other areas where homes and more were turned down, or the urban renewal project that practically leveled all of downtown, which included neighborhoods that today would be sought after neighborhoods, but then were declared dilapidated in slum areas rather than protecting them like Savannah did, for example. We just lost all of that, so I guess we're fortunate to have as much as we have now. So obviously we need to hop on board the legislation for preservation train that had been rolling for some time, but not here.
Who were some of the early pioneers, quote, in town who began to raise concerns about our historic heritage? Because some folks I know were speaking loudly and waving signs.
Right. Well, when the urban renewal project came along, the Brumby House the Church Waddell Brumby House became the catalyst, because this was a house built in the early 1800s, a real architectural gem, plus it had been the home of the president of the University of Georgia, or Franklin College then. So the need to save that brought a number of people together. Some names that come to mind are, for example, Janae Downs, and many, many other people worked hard to first get the rights to that house, and then to physically move it to where it is now, and then come up with the funding a decade later to restore the house, which is now the Athens Welcome Center. So that, and then the Athens Hardware, or the Franklin Hotel on the corner downtown now, catty corner to the newspaper building, or former newspaper building, were that too was threatened, and that was a flag waving affair that you can remember, of whole generations standing in the window saying, "Save this building."
Thank goodness. Thank goodness.
Let me add that out of that grew the Athens Clark Heritage Foundation, and that organization has been responsible for many designations prior to the local designations for the National Register of Historic Places. And if your property's on National Register and you are a commercial property, you are entitled to all sorts of tax benefits. And that's gotten that train rolling too with investors, owners.
There are so many preservation projects in Athens now. It is
indeed.
Amazing. Talk about some of those that stand out in your mind as really, really special.
To go back just a little, when we moved here in the 1960s, we, fortunately for me, came along right after the big demolitions of the houses, so I didn't actually have to witness that or see that, but I certainly heard a lot about it. But I was rather stunned that people in town, particularly people that always lived here, weren't really worried enough about what was happening. They knew they couldn't afford these places, and so they sold them off, and so then they got torn down. But there were a couple of projects when I was new in Athens. The Athens Junior Assembly had just gotten permission to operate the Taylor Grady House, which was owned by the city, and restore that. So that was going on. And then the Upson House, which was the first trust bank, was being restored and opened, which was a tremendous, wonderful project under Gilbert Milner, Buddy Milner, the father of the Gilbert Milner, who's my contemporary. So those were sterling examples and things to get excited about. The Brumby House restoration was going on, and then there followed some other very interesting projects. To jump over a few decades, we were able to save the Ray Nicholson House, for example, from demolition after losing another historic significant building to a parking lot for the Holiday Inn. That's another long story, but that saved a neighborhood through historic designation. One thing I found out is you can't save something that's not designated. If you try to do a quick designation after it's been bought and someone's going to demolish it, if it isn't protected, it's gone.
You mean prior to their purchasing it?
Yes, prior to the purchase, right. I live in 5 Points today, in the 2015 houses in my neighborhood are being demolished for new houses to be built because there's no protection. You can buy a house that's in a very cozy, feel-good sense of place neighborhood where people have lived for decades, since the 30s and 40s, but someone can come in and tear down a house and build a new house. And I think we need to work toward some sort of protection for in-town neighborhoods that are not designated as historic neighborhoods.
Do I remember a project with the Seney Stovall Chapel?
Yeah,
yes. Was it Fantasy Spalding that was very interested in that? And
the Lucy Cobb Institute in the 1930s went out of business of educating young ladies. They ran out of money about whenever everybody else ran out of money. That's the same time in which the sororities bought up the private homes, and thank goodness have done a wonderful job of protecting them and taking care of them and living in them. They're ongoing, active part of the community. But the Lucy Cobb Institute was many years in resolution. The University of Georgia owned it, and they became poor landlords. I'd say demolition by neglect. I think someone was hoping it would all fall in, including the Seney Stovall Chapel. But Fennessy Spalding, who was a wonderful, wonderful preservationist and historian, biographer of Oglethorpe, taught Georgia history for many decades at the University of Georgia, who died way too young of cancer. He and his wife, Margie Spalding, were in the business of restoring houses in Cobham, 2 of which they lived in, and others that they bought and brought back to single family or found good renters for. And he became extremely active and put lots of pressure on. And then Carl Vinson in Washington, D.C. was able to secure some funding, and today it is the Carl Vinson Institute for Government. Institute of Government. I started to say, the Carl Vinson Institute of Government operates beautifully. And Seney Stovall Chapel was also received funding and has been restored as a multi-purpose auditorium, church, performing arts center, meeting and continuing education center as well. And it's a beautiful stretch, a beautiful block, square block all the way around in Athens off of Millage Avenue, on Millage Avenue.
We've been blessed with all that. Let's segue a little bit and talk about your book.
Oh, well.
What was the impetus, and we've had this discussion, but tell us again what the impetus for the book, A Portrait of Historic Athens in Clark County, was, and how you jumped in with both feet.
Well, I had just left full-time employment and had an offer from a publishing company that at the time produced books about towns and counties around the country. And they asked me, or I suppose they might have approached Athens Clark Heritage Foundation and asked me if I'd be interested in doing it. So I had the time, and my previous jobs had been with downtown Athens and with the University of Georgia bicentennial celebration and the law school. And during those times, I'd had the occasion to write and study about the history of the town and the gown. And I found that there wasn't much out there that combined the town and the gown, with a big picture sort of thing. You had your university history, and then you had a little bit of Athens, the town history, but not how those intermingled. So I'd already had researched a lot of material for that and had that on hand. I had worked for Joe Burnett, who's another of my heroes, who was the director of the Athens Downtown Development Authority and Downtown Council. If I can go back just a little bit on the background of that. That was during the period of time that the mall opened and all of our stores downtown moved out to the mall. And that would include Davidson, which was in the old Michael Brothers building, Penny's, Sears, plus other merchants. So we were left with a little bit of a shell of a city. Right. So bringing that back into a vital business community and professional community was a full-time job, and I was lucky enough to get to work on that with Joe Burnett, and we also work with the National Trust. Athens was one of the first Main Street cities on the National Trust program. It was there were 5 in the state of Georgia and only 23 around the country. And now today you still can go many, many places through many towns and see the flags flying saying this is a Main Street program. And that is a program that gives you the expertise and works with towns on restoring and revitalizing their in-town selves, which is the essence of place, a sense of place of where we all live. So I had all that in my head, plus the propaganda of that, and then being on the staff to celebrate the sesquicentennial of the nation's oldest chartered university. I also had done a lot of writing for them on history and updating of what went on campus-wide, North and South Campus and extended property. So anyway, that's how I got started on the project. Mary Levin Koch, who did the book with me, curated the pictures, is a historian/museum person. She now lives in Lexington, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and is on the board of several eminent museums. Has a great deal of knowledge on Georgia history, and even though she's a New Englander, and on museums and art of all kinds, visual art. So she was a great, fun, wonderful resource, and she had been on the staff of the bicentennial celebration at the university, and we were together for 3 years, and she helped produce a large exhibit about the history of the University of Georgia that was up in Memorial Hall for 2 years, I guess. So we'd worked together before. So we worked our little buns off, and we got the book done, and just when we got the book done, the company that produced the books went bankrupt. So here we were with our book, many, many, many photos. But fortunately, this company gave us the rights to our book and sent us all the pictures in a big box that they had off in Production Wonderland. And I went over to the Georgia Press to talk to Karen Orchard, just to ask her for a suggestion of who might publish a book. And I was thinking of someplace like Peachtree Publisher. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, we're interested in it. Well, I was just horrified because I'm married to a rather well-known researcher, historian, Emory Thomas, and I knew the nature of serious scholarship. My book does not have, for example, footnotes. I will brag on the bibliography. It's really a good big bibliography that I hope everybody can use, future researchers can pull from. But anyway, I knew that the original book was written almost like a formula romance. You know, so many things were supposed to happen before the railroad came. And then I kept telling them we did not have riverboats coming down the Oconee River. They wished we had. They kept sending pictures of riverboats. But I knew that I had omitted or not fleshed out things that I thought were very important. Banking history or maybe drier things, but things that were part of the big history. So I said I would consider it if I could go back to the drawing board. So I worked probably another year on the book and did more research.
What a committed lady.
Well, I by then I was obsessed with it, as you can tell by, I go back and look at these sentences. I said, how many facts did you want to put in one sentence? But that's what we did, and then they sent it to readers, and I can say there weren't too many suggestions, and they got it out fairly quickly.
It's a great book. Then in
2009, Karen Orchard took me out to lunch and said we'd like to do a reprint of the book, and would you be interested in writing a updated chapter? And I went, oh gosh, no, absolutely not. But they had gotten a grant from the Wormslow Foundation, which is a wonderful foundation. It's helped George Press out a lot. And that grant covered the cost of color for the book and also 200 color pictures.
Wow.
Added. So by then, Mary Koch was not involved because she had moved and other things. So I worked with that myself and with George Press, who helped get those up. But I do think that the second edition, although it's a paperback, is really a more handsome edition, and the edition of the pictures is terrific. But I thought I'd just write a little introduction, a little PS to the introduction, and say this update is, this is just a little update of pictures. And then I thought, oh my gosh, so many things had happened in that period of time. Incredible number. So I would say it was harder to write the updated chapter than the entire rest of the book. For example, we had the house that moved away and came back from Stone Mountain, the TRR Cobb House, which not many people can claim, not many towns can claim to have a place like that. Monumental, huge story, could write a book just about what happened with that, how it had belonged to the Catholic Church, how the Catholic Church wanted the property to have another use, how no one would come forward to save the house, how it got hauled off on a truck to Stone Mountain, and where it stayed boarded up for 20 years because it never got off the ground in their southern theme park. And then the effort to mount its return to Athens, and then the money through the Watson Brown Foundation to restore it to all its glory. So it took in 20 years to move 2 blocks and be restored. So that was one story. And then there was the saga of the demolition of the Hull Snelling House, which was where the old book ended. And then the new book was the designation of that district and the Ray Nicholson House that eventually became the Alumni Center for the University of Georgia. So that was another story. Then there was the whole battle about the Classic Center, where we had the New York architects who wanted to tear down our little fire hall number 1, and how the city and citizens finally had the guts to say, oh, well, we wasted $1 million. We're just going to go back to the drawing boards. And what a wonderful, wonderful facility grew out of that. So those are just some of the things that happened in those years. And now, since that's happened, so much more has happened. I will never, ever.
I was getting ready. Third edition? Do I hear a third edition coming?
Oh, no. I mean, an entire new city block of Athens. Kitty condos rising up to the sky with swimming pools on the top. I just couldn't cover that.
The changes. And
But I do think that it's so important that we continue to appreciate the sense of place here. It's so easy to lose, and it can go so fast. That's what I'm passionate about.
This is a segue. We traveled down the Natchez Trace this spring, and there is a place where a whole town stood until 1890, I want to say, and the effects of the Civil War and the effects of yellow fever and a number of other things. The only thing left of that whole town, there were 2,500 people living there. There's still a Methodist church that the folks in the area keep the Methodist church up, and then a few artifacts that are just out in the middle of sort of a swampy, piney area.
Yeah.
And you think about all those people, the people who died and were buried there somewhere, are the folks that were just
pioneers to that
those
area.
people were there, and now it's just gone.
Well, of course, people were pioneers here too. The Senatus Academicus came here to they were charged to find a location for a healthful location for a university far from taverns and so forth. And as you know, we don't have any taverns here now.
No, not at all.
But the university, of course, is why this town is here. But it's a wonderful blessing, but it's a mixed blessing, because we always have to have the balance to let the town breathe around the university.
It's a good way to say that.
I think a lot of effort's gone into that, and as the university's just so mushroomed in size, we have hung on.
Still working to retain
to
that balance.
A particular quality of life,
right. Absolutely. As you researched the history of this area, I know you bumped into some interesting characters, because there are still some interesting characters around today. Are there 2 or 3 that come to mind to you of in the dark, distant past who were just interesting people?
Well, there were some people that Amory and I were fortunate enough to know. I don't know if you call it the dark, distant past, but when we moved here, there were some giants. Dean Rusk, for example, came here with the law school and was our neighbor when we lived on Hill Street. Also, Eugene Odom was such a giant, the father of ecology, and we were able to go with him to Sapelo Island many times with student groups. Lamar Dodd was a force in his own right. Hubert Owen, and the landscape architect. There were Fennessy Spalding, such a wonderful person, so skilled and talented. I would like to mention among my heroes John Waters as well. He established the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Georgia. He restored a house on Millage Circle, beautiful old house, he and his wife Charlotte. But he wrote helped draft much of the legislation for historic preservation for the state of Georgia. And of course has been extremely hands-on active in his own home, in his own town, Athens. Plus he has raised up generations of professional preservationists at work today, at home and abroad.
You know, we were blessed in so many ways about the folks, even from the earliest days, 1801 or prior to that, but not much prior to that. 1785, I guess.
Yeah.
Of the kind of people who came and what they did and
Exactly.
the kind of foundation they laid for.
Well, the people that came to Athens in the beginning, you have the Frenchman Charbonnet who designed buildings. You had all these New England people that came down, and our early presidents who graduated from the only couple of colleges that were going at the time, Hampton, Sydney, Yale, William and Mary, those schools. There weren't any schools much that predated our school. There were of course, Dean Tate, everybody that encountered him just was mesmerized. Talk about a character. Hamilton Holmes, we were lucky enough to know because we worked with the Foundation Fellows program that he worked with for some years.
You're right. We just are
many interesting residents of, for example, Deering Street, some real characters in that area. Ms. Sewell, whose father had been with the university, was the glamour queen of Athens when we first came. Beautifully dressed elderly lady before parties would lie on the bed and hang her head over so that the color would rise to her cheeks so she could go out that evening and be her effervescent self.
I may have to try that.
I think she has a successor in Suzanne King who does not have to hang her head over, but Suzanne is a contemporary of mine who's an artist and married to a chemistry professor, and she carries on the tradition
the
of
same lovely kind. Well, of course,
lovely beauty.
Someday we need you to write a book about some of the folks along those lines, some of the maiden ladies who maybe several sisters lived together.
Oh, yes.
The Anderson sisters on Henderson Avenue.
Yeah.
A number of folks who have wonderful, it's just a wonderful
story.
Well,
a couple of generations back, of course, brothers and sisters lived together. They had lost family members in wars or
never married and just
never married.
Spent their lives.
There were more. Yeah. Today our maiden ladies are saving the world from hate in Africa. They are running the world.
CEOs.
Running the world. The CEOs of the world.
All right, Fran, that sounds like a good idea. Let's think about that book.
All right.
What events? You mentioned a few things that were in the last revision of your book, but what other events over the years are big events that changed Athens or helped to mold Athens, do you think?
I can remember a celebration of the bicentennial of our country with everyone dressed up in costume hanging out at the Taylor Grady house, that kind of thing. when we first moved here, we came the year that Fred Davidson became the president of the university. So we went to his inaugural, and we've been to a few other inaugurals of presidents since then. My husband, Amory, was on the search committee for Chuck Knapp when he became president of the university. And of course, we've had a few very good presidents, I think, long-termers who've done some remarkable things. From a preservationist point of view, Michael Adams certainly can be pointed to as a person who appreciated the, of course, every single thing I wish he might have done, but for the most part, the community should be very grateful to him from the town point of view for preservation of the gown.
I was going to ask you how you rate Athens today in terms of its commitment to historic preservation.
Well, one book I wanted to write was, or an article called "A Funny Thing Happened to Me on the Way to the Preservation Movement." Because when I came here, literally, I was the only young person involved. That most of the people involved were little old ladies in tennis shoes. And now I'm a little old lady in no shoes. I'm doing this interview barefooted. But I find that there are so many young people that are interested in preservation. I worry a little bit that right now it's sort of a socially acceptable pursuit.
A fad?
I hope it's not a fad, exactly. That I want the people involved to have the knowledge of what it is they're looking at. I want them to be visually literate. I want them to understand the evolution of architecture and this town, and to appreciate it right up to recent years, and not be allow us to become vanilla.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always teetering as to how I would rate this town. Well, for example, and I need to follow through on this. Recently, I read in the Banner Herald that we're going to replenish the trees on Millage Avenue that have been that have died or been struck by lightning or blown over in storms because they're old. But there's no discussion of putting the utility lines underground. So this is going to be a replenishment of trees from 5 Points to Broad Street. There are about 36 utility poles all on one side of the street. They're dangerous because it's still a relatively
2 inches
narrow,
away from the
2
road.
inches away from the road. I have never heard that discussed. And it seems to me with SPLOST, with our special local legislation sales tax that we come up with every few years, that might be a goal to work with Georgia Power, telephone people, to get those underground before we plant these trees, which are going to be zapped or their branches are going to knock out the electricity and so forth. I think we need to keep on keeping on thinking imaginatively. What suburb do you drive through that has power lines running down the side of their main boulevards or main roads? It's just not there. So we need to do for our in-town neighborhoods and streets what is just de rigueur for anything new.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
I have so many soapboxes.
I was getting ready to say, you keep on keeping on. That's what you need to do. Don't sit down. Fran, let's go back. We were talking about some of the many preservation projects in town that have come about as we're trying to save our tangible past. Talk about, is it the whole?
The whole Snelling house.
Talk about the whole Snelling area and what transpired in that
This is your classic good news, bad news story. Sometimes you have to lose something to gain something else. I regret very much what we had to lose, but adjacent to the Holiday Inn downtown was the campus of Christian College, owned by the Christian Church. And that was a very, very small school to educate people that were going into Christian education in the Christian Church. Not a seminary, but more of a master's degree kind of program. It was operating on a shoestring, and they had out of a number of buildings, and very difficult, of course, to keep those buildings up. But on the edge of that, toward downtown, toward Broad Street, but on Hull Street, was the Hull Snelling House. And that it was a Greek Revival house, but not the classic kind where you've just come out of the movie Gone with the Wind and here's a replica, but a very fine Greek Revival house that had been the home of a president of the University of Georgia, Herbert Hoover, had dinner there when he came to do a commencement speech. And it had the bones of a really fine house, and it was adjacent to the university. And at the time, I thought, and I think even pitched this to the administration, that whole area would have been a good place to expand the law school, which was at the time looking for expansion room, because it had the land, it had some empty land, and it had a number of buildings on it. But the Holiday Inn wanted that property, and the Christian Church were the front men because they owned it, but the real powers behind were the Holiday Inn. So I was chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, and we set about trying desperately to establish the Hull Street Historic District, which would include the Ray Nicholson House on one end, the Hull Snelling on the other, two very nice sort of Edwardian cottages in between, and two other cottages around the corner. But some lawyers came from Atlanta and pled all the straight up property, your rights property. And indeed that probably was true because it wasn't designated. We were, as I said before, we passed the ordinance relatively late, and we were just trying to designate our first historic districts. We started with Tiny Woodlawn just because we wanted to do Millage Avenue, but there was such an uproar that we had to go to a much smaller area. So we did Woodlawn, and then later moved on to Bloomfield and Boulevard and Cobham as the first historic districts, but we hadn't gotten around to things like Hull Street. And we're just talking relatively few years, and it's a lot of paperwork, a lot of meetings, a lot of announcements in the newspaper saying what's happening. But the Hull Snelling House was in disrepair. Ladies had lived in it, maiden ladies, for a long time, and then it even became, I think I had a meal there in a restaurant when it was briefly a restaurant, and then it was also a fraternity house for a bit, as almost everything has been in Athens in between big houses. But people became very passionate about the house, and in front of the house sat this enormous magnolia tree. So the bulldozers arrived, and literally people were out there screaming and yelling and carrying banners and lying down. It's the classic lie down in front of the bulldozer thing, but the bulldozers continued on, did not run over the people who got up, and the house was demolished. There's some pretty dramatic pictures of the house going down. So after that, with the help of John Barrow, who was then on City County Commission, we worked very hard and were able to designate the Ray Nicholson House as an individual landmark, and then to designate the whole area as a historic district. So when it came time, and there was a plan to demolish the Ray Nicholson House, which really was a Gone with the Wind type Greek Revival house that anybody visiting town would say, a real live Greek Revival house. I want to go back to talking about the Hull Snelling House just a minute to give it its due, and if you don't mind, I'll read a little from my book on that part from
Sounds good.
page 252 in this book. Hurried efforts, after heated public debate and a series of hearings before the Historic Preservation Commission and City Council, then Mayor Dwayne Chambers broke the council's tie vote to defeat a designation for a historic district, which would have saved the house. Hurried efforts to find a sympathetic buyer who would save and preserve the house failed. So, on Wednesday, May 23, 1990, a bulldozer leveled the 150-year-old Greek Revival landmark, one of the oldest houses remaining in Athens, and once the home of Asbury Hall, Speaker of the Georgia House and State Senator, and later the residence of the University of Georgia President Charles Snelling. Preservationists and environmentalists alike were shocked when the college carried out its threat to demolish the trees on the lot, including a noble magnolia estimated to be 116 years old. At any rate, a sale went forward to the Holiday Inn, and the lot became a parking lot, which it remains today. But I read that because it's such a classic story of something so shocking that you couldn't really stop legally, but it got to the hearts of people. And I think the university and the town alike were drawn up short. And then when there was discussion of tearing down the Ray Nicholson house, it didn't get too far.
A hue and cry went up.
Hue and cry, and some money got involved, and some big legislation, and some stays of execution sorts of things. Some heroic efforts went on, and we were able to get that area designated. I will say, though, that in a recent drive-by survey by moi, I'm famous for driving around and checking on these things, the two cottages that face our new research library they seem to be practicing demolition by neglect again. No one's using them, paint's peeling, and it's not looking good. So that's something to watch.
Get your banner out.
Yeah, get my banner out again, unfurl it.
What other things do we need to talk about that the future generations who might watch you on this tape, what do they need to know?
How much I enjoyed living in Athens when it was smaller, but how much I appreciate the ways in which we've grown, the development of the cultural life in Athens. There's no reason to have to go to Atlanta anymore, except I'm going over on Wednesday to get a visa to visit Russia. But I just think keeping a sense of place is so important. And I hope that will go on always.
What a great note to end on. We thank you for letting us come back.
Oh, thank you for letting me preach.
And we hope that, like a bad penny, I know you hope we don't keep turning up at your front door with Bill and camera, although it would always be fun to see Bill.
I'd like to interview the three of you next.
But we thank you so much for sharing and talking about your memories about saving historic Athens, and we thank you for doing just that, saving historic Athens.
Oh, I don't know that I've done that, but thanks for coming.